Hello and welcome to the Anthrozoology Podcast. Today we are excited to continue our discussion with Dr. Madi Mañetto Quick, who completed her PhD research in the more than human worlds of farms and farm animal sanctuaries at the Teherangiwaka Victoria University of Wellington. So you made, again, if you can explain to our listeners how you used speculative design, which again I'd never heard of. Fascinating concept. There's so many fascinating concepts out there. I want to try them all, but it's just impossible. But speculative design to make a pluriversal course, so people could take these course prompts and then create their own vision. Could you explain that in much better detail than I just have?
So, as part of a design research dissertation, I had a visual design output, and that took a speculative approach where speculative design is sort of imagining visions of the future to prompt thought or discussion or questions. And they can be quite radical, or it can be quite a plausible futuring. In my case, it was a little more implausible. I created a number of different kind of speculative experiments with ways of telling stories about farmed animals. And the final one I arrived at, which is what you were talking about, is a kind of speculative workshop. There's another field of design called co-design, which really stresses a collaborative design approach instead of the sole designer kind of designing from a top-down approach. Co-design brings in generally other people to be part of the co-design process through workshops, different kinds of activities. So I kind of took that co-design approach, but shifted it slightly so that the participants were not only other people, but also other animals and parts of the land. So I designed a number of kind of prompts within this workshop for humans, animals, and the land to do together. So these would be quite like imaginative. Sometimes the prompts would be asking the humans to switch places with an animal within the workshop. It might be asking the land to kind of start a forest fire or to flood the kind of place where the humans live. And obviously, I can't really prescribe what the land is going to do. So it was about finding creative ways to imagine what might happen if the land was given a kind of participant role within the workshop. But it was all to kind of try to equalize the beings within a space that might be quite like a sanctuary or quite like a farm, depending on what the humans and the animals decide to do together.
I see that you also said that you hadn't asked anybody to do it and you weren't running it as a workshop. But I was wondering if in any pilot stages, you actually asked anybody else to partake in this imaginary process. Is that something you did? And how did they find it?
I didn't really do that. I did spend a lot of time with my supervisors thinking through what it would be like to take part in some of the prompts, and a lot of those conversations were quite funny and kind of imaginative. One of my supervisors suggested having like a disaster pack where all of the cards are about dealing with disasters within the workshop. There are so many ideas that I didn't get to do, which I think, not to toot my own horn, but I feel like that's one of the good things about speculative design is that it should prompt a lot of imagination and thinking, what if things were like this? For example, I didn't include cards on like bacteria or fungi or like the microbes within the workshop. And I think that could be really interesting and bringing our attention to aspects of more than human worlds that are invisible and that we might not think about very much. So bringing them in as participants would be something I would be really interested in doing. But yeah, I would love to run parts of the workshop in a real life setting. And if I got to kind of teach within a course on some aspect of design or more than human studies, I feel like it could be used as a unit within one of the classes. Yeah, I would love to do that.
Yeah, I think
That's
it's
fun.
something. I mean, Michelle's a teacher. I mean, she'd probably find doing something like that very exciting within the classroom.
Merlin Sheldrake as well wrote a book called Entangled Life, which was very like a really good book on fungi and the wonderful world of fungi, which I know very little about, and there's so much to know.
Could we take us back for just a minute? And I think a lot of our listeners probably don't know what multi-species design even entails. So is that something that you could sort of explain why you chose that course of study, and then what exactly that means? Like, what does someone who becomes a multi-species designer do?
Sure, I think I'd almost like to take it back to that first course I took in multi-species design, where the professor talked about a lot of different human-animal relationships and how elements of the designed world kind of mediate those relationships. Even thinking about something as simple as a dog bed or a crate that you keep a dog in is an example, a physical example of multi-species design. But the way I onboarded it within my own projects is thinking about using design to explore and to question our relationships with non-human animals. And in my other design courses, we had pretty much only focused on human interactions. So it really broadened my mind to think about whatever you design, whether it's an interaction, a service, a system, a product, it's going to have more than human repercussions. It might even have more than human users. So thinking about design as not just something that humans experience or interact with, but as something that animals do as well. In that course, I created a photo essay about the wolves in Yellowstone, and that was kind of my introduction into exploring ways of telling stories about animals. And then for my second project, it was a group project, and we visited egg farms, and then we created a kind of speculative product that would teach consumers about where their eggs come from so they could kind of understand what it was like for the farmers and a bit more about what it's like for the chickens. And then after that project, I have focused specifically on farmed animals and to kind of highlight the experiences of farmed animals, to tell stories about them, and to kind of make them visible. I think that's why I've stuck with farmed animals, is because they are a morally troubling reality that kind of suffuses all of life, but a lot of times we don't see them and we don't see the people who work with them. So that's my mission statement, is to see them and to see the people who interact with them on a daily basis.
Well, I think that's interesting too, because as you were talking about the sanctuaries, the farmed animal sanctuaries, I started thinking about the fact that when a human decides to start a sanctuary, the sanctuary itself, the purpose may be in service to other species, but in reality, the entire setup of the farm, the physical structure, the working structure, the relationship structure is all really based upon what's most convenient for the human. So did you ever run into sanctuary owners, or in your readings find any sanctuary owners that really grappled with that? Am I making it more convenient for myself, making it easier for the humans to care for these other species, or am I really taking into account just what I need to get the work done?
I think this really brings to mind a story within one of the memoirs where the sanctuary owner started to grapple with the fact that when there were sick animals, she would have them put down, and she was thinking, am I just doing this because it's easier for me and it's making me feel more comfortable? And after that, she decided to forego euthanasia altogether, no matter the circumstance of the animal, which is quite a hard line to take. So she was so uncomfortable with imposing her her making herself more comfortable that she decided not to do that altogether, which I think is a really kind of more that's the prominent one that comes to mind. But yeah, that is something I write about in my thesis, is this idea of captive freedom, where a lot of farm animal sanctuary owners talk about the animals being happy and free, but they're only free to a certain extent because they still need to be kept within fences, and the world at large doesn't permit farmed animals to be completely unleashed into the wilds. So it's, yeah, as free as possible.
Well, and sometimes that freedom, because I work a lot in Nepal, sometimes that freedom to be released is not freedom, because then there's no food, and there's the danger of being, I'm thinking specifically of cows in India and Nepal, and being let loose when you're no longer reproductively valuable, and a lot of starvation and hit by car and beatings, and yeah, so it's a very strange line we have to walk, balancing the freedom and the lack of freedom.
Yeah, even keeping a companion animal sometimes does feel like that, where they're so close to us and they're kind of part of our human network almost, rather than being kind of animals, and we have them in a really specific way where they're kind of designed into our lives. Yeah.
And that brings me on to something, I can't find it right now, but I recall reading in your thesis that you mentioned doing an exercise where you think into the future, or the idea is to think into the future with the animals, think into the future, yourself and the landscape. But you said something about you couldn't finish that because you couldn't think that far into that. I'm guessing you meant utopia or something. Sorry, I don't have it in front of me. Can you explain a bit about that and why we weren't able to imagine this non-captive freedom and how that would then work?
Yeah, so one of the speculative design experiments I began and ultimately abandoned was adopting the perspective of an imaginary sanctuary owner. And through her journal pages, I was imagining a kind of end to farming where viruses spread throughout farmed animals within Aotearoa, New Zealand, natural disasters, kind of just these catastrophic events, similar that were inspired by the 2001 foot and mouth pandemic in the UK, which decimated so many farmed animals. And I kind of drew from that real world experience and all of the grief surrounding that, and kind of imagined this happening in a future scenario so that I could arrive at what I wanted the main part of the story to be, which is what would our relationship with farmed animals be like if the end of farming had happened? And I just couldn't get there. I think I kind of almost psyched myself out of it and thinking, this is what I present is what my utopia is, and I don't know what that could mean. And I also thought I wasn't really representing the context of farms very well. The non-human characters were sort of somewhat sidelined. as was the land. So in many ways, it wasn't meeting my framework very well. And I thought that kind of proposing a story that has a sort of beginning, middle, and end instead of what I did arrive at, which was at the workshop, which is more asking questions rather than providing a singular story. That's partly why I let it go. But it was, and actually doing that journal was quite, it really catalyzed the shift from focusing just on sanctuaries to focusing on farms as well, because I was thinking I'm only showing one imagined sanctuary owner's perspective. And in many ways, I was just sort of reiterating on memoirs instead of pushing the boundaries and creating something that was a little more new. I mean, I still think about that because a lot of the vegan dream of utopia is to see a world where we don't farm animals industrially or at all in some cases. And a lot of the time I see that as the dream, but I'd really like to see a really kind of potent visualization or a story of what that actually looks like. And I would really like to see that. And I think that could be another thing building off my research is to look for those stories because I think, yeah, you don't often futures are quite dystopian, but I'd like to see one where we reimagine our relationship with farmed animals where it's not awful.
Yeah, because there is no utopia really, is there, with the way that except in movies, perhaps. I don't know, I'm thinking Narnia, but even that wasn't a utopia. Yeah, it's with anyway, I'm going to stop there. But yes, that's no, it's really interesting. It's interesting. I wonder how many different points of view and different vegan I'm using the word vegan dreams, but even how many no longer farming dreams, how people would think about that, how many different people would think of it in different ways, which is why I think it's a really interesting workshop that you've come up with. And I think it'd be interesting to put it out there and see, what people's ideas would be. But I know it's a lot of work to do that kind of thing, but I think it'd be great for sure.
It's a great brain exercise.
Yeah, definitely. It'd be a really good workshop actually for some of the anthrozoology conferences and things.
Yeah, because part of the workshop is you decide, are you going to kill animals for food or are you not going to? And doing a workshop in a group of people with different viewpoints might bring up some disagreements and interesting conversations. I would really like to. Also, there's no repercussions. I'm not actually telling anyone they have to go and do that. It's about thinking through these things in a critical and creative way.
Creates the different pluriverses for sure. Yeah.
I was just wondering where you want to go next. Now that you've graduated, do you have sort of a dream research project that you'd like to do, or what? Where do you see yourself taking this research or starting new research?
In some ways, I'd almost like to be part of someone else's larger project and bring my own perspective into it, just so that it's just because sometimes a PhD can be very solitary and you're working away at this thing mostly on your own, coming up with in my case, I mean, my supervisors were amazing and we had so many discussions that were so helpful. But I think most of the time you're sort of thinking of these ideas by yourself, seeing if they work, seeing if they're valid, making sure they meet the academic standard of a PhD. And I think I'd really like to be part of a team of researchers working in this field of sort of anthrozoology, and bringing my own kind of designerly perspective into that. My dream would be to keep working on this kind of thing, and especially our relationship with farmed animals. But yeah, just thinking more broadly how I could bring that research into other contexts as well. So yeah, I'm still very like fresh off my PhD, so it's yeah, I almost want to be somewhat relaxed.
You are allowed to take time off.
Yeah. But I think even having this conversation is reigniting so many things, because I've almost put it somewhat to the back of my mind, but I'm still kind of writing for publication. But this has made me think, yeah, I want to go back out there and kind of talk to more interesting people and see where it goes. One of my big inspirations throughout my PhD was another PhD thesis by a designer at she did her PhD at Malmo, Michelle Westerlaken, and her thesis was called Imagining Multi-Species Worlds. And it's an amazing thesis. The design work she does is incredible, but also the way she wrote it was beautiful. Like it was a story from beginning to end. And if I could just have an ounce of that within my thesis, I would consider it a success. But yeah, I've really been interested in it. She finished her PhD a few years before mine, and she's working at Cambridge now, but I've been kind of tracking her career because she's, yeah, just really amazing.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. I'll definitely pick that up.
It's also just she designed the whole thesis. Now I'm just gushing about her work, but the cover is hand drawn, and it's just beginning to end the most beautiful thesis I've ever seen. So yeah, that was a big inspiration throughout.
Cool. Right, you've got something else I'm going to look at now. There's so many.
It's good. This is where we get all our reading lists going.
Yeah, it's all open access, so it's easy to find.
Oh, nice. Fantastic. Thank you for joining us today on the Anthrozoology Podcast with our special guest, Dr. Madi Mañetto Quick. Please join us for the next episode, where we continue to delve into the fascinating field of anthrozoology, examining where interconnected worlds of humans and other animals in our lives intersect.